It's time for us to have a look at this really interesting topic about the tech giants. And we had earlier on with John's article at the Flow News 24 desk, the situation with China. And I've brought our Flow News 24 editor here in our Roseworthy Media Centre, and he has joined me, Ricky Lambert. I'm going to ask you about the situation with the tech giants and what the government's done up until now in relation to them.
Yeah, good morning, Wayne and listeners. The federal government had a great slap at Facebook in particular, but it was also pursuing Google to make sure that they paid for Australian news when it was published on their websites. Google ended up coming to heel. Facebook had a big fight, and as you can probably all remember, a whole bunch of sites, including emergency services information, disappeared from Facebook. But then Facebook ended up losing out in the embarrassment that followed from that, and they were brought to heel. And that was probably putting more arrows in the quiver of Senator Alex Antic, who's been pursuing these tech giants, including Twitter, when it comes to how they influence Australian politics and Australian media. And here's what he had to say in part of the interview I had with him.
Twitter, with its 1.3 billion users, and I think something like 330 million per day use Twitter. It's a lot of people. It's sort of, the entire population of the US plus a bit. Removed a sitting president of the United States with his main, probably in those days, his main ability to communicate with people. Now, they did so on the basis, they said they had a whole heap of reasons, all sorts of things. But the truth is, at the same time they were doing that, we saw examples like we saw here, where the Chinese ambassador to Australia was posting photos, mocked up photos, I might say, of an Australian soldier, sort of slitting the throat of a child, Afghan child. Yeah. So the problem is really about, if big tech companies are the arbiters of free speech, then who's watching them? And that's my problem with the whole situation.
So Senator Antic is concerned about the freedom of speech for Australian media companies. What he's saying is that the tech giants are potentially only giving people the news that they want them to get rather than a wide spectrum of news. Hence Flow News 24 being formed and giving news right across the spectre.
Well, actually, he's also saying not just for the sake of the media, but the Australian public, for you, the listener out there, when you see something on Facebook and you share it, and you can tell, that it's true, but because it offends the sensibilities of or sensitivities of a California-based left-wing, in particular, tech company, they'll filter and say, well, that can't appear on our news service or on our platform, and that's very concerning. And that's what Senator Antic's on about. Is it's about the public debate that happens around politics when people share information on Facebook, and that's where he's talking about this Polish example, for instance, where if you have your account cancelled or if you have a post blocked and you can prove that it's true, then that's a crime for the carrying service.
It's interesting because that would then put an interesting position for Liberal member Craig Kelly. As Craig has been banned effectively from Facebook, he does actually put up the odd post, but he usually puts up a source like the ABC here in Australia now, rather than the sources that he was originally using. So in a sense, if he was bringing information to the attention of the Australian public on, say, things like COVID-19 and the treatment programs for COVID-19, which was one of his key missions. Similarly, he was saying that there were treatments for COVID-19 that President Trump had actually used and got well within 2 days. Craig Kelly was censured even by his own political party, not just Facebook and others, because he wanted to get that message out.
Well, he actually also went and fell on his own sword to supposedly protect the government by moving to the crossbench because of all the heat that was going on. But that by no means was an admission by Mr. Kelly that he'd been spreading falsehoods. He was going to continue sharing the information he believed was important because, but he wasn't going to let that become something problematic for the government. But I've got to tell you, having mentioned the ABC, they've been caught out for spreading fake news in the last week. The twerking video, that the launch of a military ship in Australia, it turns out they were doctoring that footage, and the Chief of Defence actually wasn't present when the twerking happened, even though the video was made to look that way. And there's another grovelling apology they've had to make recently about them spreading fake news. So the availability for everyday Australians to share what they believe and they know to be true, they've done their own research, if the ABC is getting things wrong and having to apologise for it, I think Australians should be able to share their content too.
And it's interesting because it does then bring the question of even Google Cloud setting up at Lot 14, the old Royal Adelaide Hospital site in Adelaide, a national office. And it appears that the opposition leader, Peter Malinauskas, has welcomed their arrival, as has the Premier of South Australia. But are we in danger by allowing, say, these international larger tech giants to set up offices? Are we in danger of them actually then fabricating what we hear and see and what we get to, if you like, believe is the real news?
Well, part of that conversation that you'll be able to catch that I had with Alex Antic on our podcast channel, he also talked about the app Parler that people went to try and create as a competition to Twitter, and not only was it blocked on the Apple App Store, but even the websites hosting it were attacked. So when you have something like Google Cloud that has an ideological view that doesn't support some political views, saying, well, we won't allow certain things to be on our service, that becomes very concerning. And I know the Victorian state government have just popped up in the last couple of days, very excited that they've got Amazon that's setting up an office in Melbourne as well. So these governments and oppositions fall over themselves to attract these trillion-dollar giants that are around the world. And you've got to question, well, are they actually putting our own citizens at risk by not letting them access information or share information that they think is very important?
Well, it's the backdrop of this is that in the United States there is a organisation, Project Veritas. They're suing Twitter, and that defamation case will be looked at pretty soon. So we're going to see a lot more of this. You've started when we talked about earlier Malcolm Turnbull and Huawei and the blocking of them setting up their servers in Australia. So now we see it taken to another degree. Are we going to get freedom of speech? Alex Antic, who's a Liberal Senator in South Australia, is certainly lobbying for that, but is he going to get the support from his own party? That will be the question.